Everything surrounding the Pittsburgh Steelers right now points to an organization that is trying to walk a very fine line, and that line is between urgency and patience. According to ESPN's comprehensive offseason preview for 2026, the message coming out of the building is clear and deliberate. This is not a rebuild. That phrase matters because it sets the tone for every decision that follows. Even after the major transition at head coach, moving from Mike Tomlin to Mike McCarthy, team president and CEO Art Rooney, too, has made it clear through both his words and his actions that he believes this roster is closer to competing than starting over. The playoff drought is real. The frustration is real. But internally, the belief is that the foundation is strong enough to push forward rather than tear things down. The first layer of uncertainty, and the one that dominates every conversation around this team, is the quarterback position. There is still no clarity on who will be the starting quarterback for the 2026 season, and ESPN identified that as the top offseason priority for the Steelers. Last offseason, Pittsburgh signed Aaron Rodgers to a one-year deal, drafted Will Howard, and brought Mason Rudolph back on a 2-year contract. Now the door is open in several directions. The Steelers could try to convince the 42-year-old Rodgers to return for another season. They could look toward the 2026 draft, although ESPN notes that this appears to be a thin quarterback class. Another option is adding an inexpensive bridge quarterback while keeping their eyes on the 2027 draft, or even exploring the possibility of a blockbuster trade for a quarterback stuck in a difficult situation elsewhere. None of these paths are simple, and none of them come without risk. What is interesting, though, is how quickly the conversation shifts away from quarterback when you really dig into the roster. ESPN listed adding a true number 2 wide receiver as the second biggest offseason priority, and that speaks volumes about where this offense fell short. The Steelers tried to make it work with DK Metcalf and an ensemble cast of pass catchers, but the results were inconsistent at best. Metcalf drew constant attention from opposing defenses, and teams had success taking him out of games because there simply was not another receiver who could consistently win one-on-one matchups. The situation became even more glaring when Metcalf was absent late in the season due to suspension, exposing just how thin the depth was behind him. The numbers tell a harsh story. Outside of Metcalf, no Steelers wide receiver even reached 400 receiving yards on the season. This is not a new problem either. 2 years ago, it was an issue when Russell Wilson was under center and Van Jefferson was asked to be the number 2 receiver. Last season, it turned into a rotating group of wide receiver 4 and 5 types trying and failing to establish themselves as reliable options. The conclusion from ESPN, and frankly from anyone watching closely, is unavoidable. It does not matter who the quarterback is if the passing game lacks weapons. Without another legitimate threat opposite Metcalf, defenses will continue to load coverage his way and dare Pittsburgh to beat them elsewhere. That reality feeds directly into the draft outlook. ESPN draft analyst Matt Miller believes the Steelers will likely be out of range for the top quarterback prospects once again, but he sees a real opportunity to add an impact wide receiver in the first round. He specifically mentioned USC's My Lemon as a dynamic route runner and yards after the catch producer who would thrive alongside Metcalf. Beyond that, ESPN's big prediction for the offseason is that Pittsburgh will use multiple draft picks on promising young wide receivers. With many of last year's receivers heading into free agency, this draft represents a chance to inject youth, speed, and upside into a room that desperately needs it. The logic is clear when you look at the bigger picture. Metcalf is locked into a massive contract, making $30 million per season. The Steelers are likely to add a solid veteran receiver in free agency on a shorter-term deal, probably in the $15 to $20 million per year range. What they still need is a high-end receiver on a rookie contract, someone who can grow with the offense over the next 5 years while Metcalf remains the financial centerpiece of the position. With 12 draft picks at their disposal, Pittsburgh has the flexibility to move around the board if the right player starts to slide. ESPN's analysis, combined with the roster construction, makes it hard to imagine a scenario where the Steelers do not double dip at wide receiver in the draft. All of this ties back to the central theme of this offseason, maximizing what the Steelers already have instead of starting over. The belief inside the organization is that with the right supporting cast, the quarterback position becomes less of a limitation and more of a complementary piece. Give that quarterback better weapons, give him a stronger, more reliable structure, and suddenly the offense looks very different. That belief is also why the Steelers are approaching this offseason with confidence rather than desperation, even as national outlets continue to question their ceiling. ESPN's early power rankings place Pittsburgh at number 21 for the 2026 season, a ranking that reflects skepticism about the quarterback situation more than anything else. But history suggests the Steelers rarely bottom out the way some expect them to. The roster is not far away, and the margin between being a fringe playoff team and a legitimate contender can be thinner than it appears. That is why the moves made at wide receiver and how the front office navigates the quarterback decision will define this offseason and potentially the next era of Steelers football. From where you sit as a fan, looking at this plan and this philosophy, do you agree with the idea that this roster is close enough to push forward without rebuilding, or do you think the Steelers are underestimating how much still needs to change? The other pillar that cannot be ignored in this conversation is the defense, because while the spotlight naturally gravitates toward quarterbacks and wide receivers, the reality is that Pittsburgh's short-term path to contention still runs through that side of the ball. ESPN's preview indirectly highlights this by framing the offense as incomplete rather than broken, while the defense is viewed as a unit that should already be better than what it has shown. For years, this defense has been paid and talked about like a top-tier group, yet the results have too often landed in the good but not great category. That gap between expectation and production is one of the quiet frustrations inside the organization. The Steelers are not lacking talent defensively. What they have lacked is consistency and, at times, adaptability. Predictable fronts, predictable coverages, and linebackers being put in difficult situations made it easier for sharp offensive play callers to find weaknesses. That context is important when you look at the optimism surrounding Patrick Graham stepping in as defensive coordinator. Graham's reputation is built on being multiple and flexible, adjusting his schemes to fit his personnel rather than forcing players into rigid roles. At his previous stops, he managed to extract competitive performances from rosters that were far less talented than what he now inherits in Pittsburgh. That alone has created a sense of belief that this defense can finally jump from solid to elite, and that jump matters more than ever given how the Steelers appear to be thinking about the quarterback position. ESPN's analysis suggests that Pittsburgh understands none of the available quarterback options, whether it is a returning veteran or a short-term bridge solution, will single-handedly transform the franchise into a Super Bowl favorite. Instead, the formula they seem to be chasing is one we have seen work elsewhere. Surround a capable quarterback with an elite defense and a strong group of skill position players, then let structure and efficiency do the rest. It is the same blueprint that helped Philadelphia maximize Jalen Hurts and allowed Seattle to stay competitive with Sam Darnold. In that context, bringing back Aaron Rodgers for another season becomes far more logical if the pieces around him are upgraded. This philosophy also explains why ESPN's early power ranking of 21st feels more like a reflection of uncertainty than a true evaluation of talent. The Steelers have not been a bottom-tier team in a very long time, and despite repeated predictions of collapse, they continue to hover around the playoff picture. The roster does not need a complete overhaul to take a meaningful step forward. A more dangerous wide receiver room, a defense that finally plays to its potential, and improved offensive play calling under Mike McCarthy could realistically push this team back into the upper half of the league. What makes this offseason so fascinating is that it feels like a crossroads without being a reset. The front office, led by Omar Khan, has cap space, draft capital, and a clear understanding of where the roster falls short. ESPN's projection that Pittsburgh will aggressively target wide receivers in the draft aligns perfectly with that reality. If they come away with one immediate impact receiver early and another developmental option later, suddenly the offense looks far more balanced. Pair that with the defense that Graham can elevate, and the Steelers' internal confidence starts to make a lot more sense. The phrase ESPN used, "not a rebuild," is not just a headline. It is a declaration of intent. The Steelers believe they are closer than many outsiders think, and this offseason is about proving that belief right through smart, targeted moves rather than flashy desperation plays. Whether that confidence is justified will only be answered on the field, but the plan itself is now clearly visible. One more layer that deserves attention in all of this is how timing plays into the Steelers' decisions. Because this offseason is not just about what moves are made, but when they are made. ESPN's preview subtly points to patience as a defining characteristic of Pittsburgh's approach. They are not rushing to force a quarterback decision simply to quiet outside noise. Instead, the organization appears comfortable letting the market develop, letting the draft board fall, and allowing leverage to work in their favor. That is a very Steelers-like way of operating, and it reinforces the idea that internally they feel no panic. That patience is especially important when you consider the draft capital at their disposal. Having 12 draft picks gives the Steelers multiple paths to improvement. They can sit tight and let value come to them, or they can be aggressive if a player they truly believe in starts to slide. ESPN's expectation that Pittsburgh could trade up for a wide receiver fits perfectly into that framework. When you combine Metcalf's long-term contract with the need for a cost-controlled running mate, the logic behind being aggressive becomes hard to ignore. This is not about adding depth for the sake of depth. It is about adding a player who can change how defenses line up on Sundays. At the same time, the Steelers are clearly aware that youth alone is not enough. A rookie receiver, no matter how talented, cannot carry an offense by himself in year one. That is why the idea of pairing draft picks with a reliable veteran in free agency keeps coming up in ESPN's analysis. A balanced receiver room, one that blends experience with upside, would immediately raise the floor of the offense. It would also make life easier for whoever lines up at quarterback, whether that is Rodgers returning for one more run or a different bridge option tasked with steering the ship. The broader takeaway from ESPN's offseason outlook is that Pittsburgh is betting on structure. They are betting that better coaching alignment, especially with Mike McCarthy on offense and Patrick Graham on defense, will unlock more from the same core of players. They are betting that targeted upgrades matter more than wholesale changes. And they are betting that the gap between where they are now and where they want to be is smaller than national rankings suggest. That is a calculated gamble, not an emotional one. For fans, this creates a strange mix of familiarity and anticipation. The Steelers are doing what they have always done, trusting their process and their evaluations. Yet the context feels different because of the recent playoff frustrations and the coaching transition. ESPN's message, intentionally or not, frames this offseason as a test of that belief system. If the Steelers hit on their wide receiver additions, stabilize the quarterback position, and see the defense take a real step forward, the narrative around this team could shift quickly. If they fall short, the questions will only get louder. Everything now hinges on execution. The plan is clear, the priorities are defined. The confidence from inside the building is evident. What remains is seeing whether those ideas translate into wins when the games matter most. As this offseason unfolds, every signing, every draft pick, and every coaching decision will be judged against that simple standard. Another important angle that ESPN's preview indirectly brings into focus is how much pressure this offseason places on evaluation rather than volume. The Steelers are not in a position where simply adding bodies will solve their issues. Every addition has to fit a very specific purpose. When you look at the way this roster is constructed, especially on offense, there is very little margin for error. One wrong assumption about a receiver's ability to separate, or one misread on how quickly a rookie can adjust to NFL coverages, and the entire plan starts to wobble. That is why the front office's confidence in its scouting department is such a critical part of this equation. The same applies to the quarterback discussion. ESPN laid out the options, but what really stands out is what was not said. There is no indication that the Steelers feel desperate to chase a splash move at quarterback just to make headlines. That tells you they believe the environment around the quarterback matters more than the name itself. With improved offensive structure under Mike McCarthy, a stronger wide receiver group, and a defense that can consistently control games, the Steelers are betting that they can win without needing a top-5 quarterback in the short term. That belief is either going to look very smart or very stubborn a year from now. Defensively, the expectations around Patrick Graham continue to loom large. This is not a subtle change. The Steelers